Our next sample is going to be a facing. A facing is something that you see on the top of a garment. It finishes that raw edge and gives it some structure. So to make this sample, we need a 5 by 8 inch piece that will be the garment, a 3 by 8 inch piece that will be the facing. So basically you just take an 8 by 8 and cut 3 inches of it off, and you'll have one be the facing. And then we need to work with our interfacing. Go ahead and get the interfacing out. You are going to cut a 3 inch by 8 inch piece of this. The best way to do that is just go ahead and place this onto your interfacing, work right off one of the edges and cut around it so that you'll have a piece that matches it. All right. After that, you're going to go and take the wrong side of your fabric that says facing, and then take your interfacing piece, being real careful that you put the beads of glue down on the wrong side of the fabric, and you're going to put an iron on that and very gently hit it. If your interfacing again is thin like mine, it's kind of a soft interfacing or softer fabric, it doesn't take much to heat it up and get it to glue on there. You don't have to, melt it on there in a super strong permanent way. It's going to be stitched onto, so just heat it up so it's just lightly attached, and then you'll be in good shape. If you do not have fusible interfacing, you don't have the one with the beads, yours is going to be a sew-in kind, so that you're going to have to take your interfacing, lay it on again to the wrong side, and baste up here in the seam allowance like about 3/8. Run your basting stitch, and then that will hold that on while you construct. All right, we'll go ahead to the to the sewing machine and finish up there. Okay, continuing on with the facing, here we have our facing pinned right sides together to our garment, have our interfacing on this side, and what we're going to do is stitch on a 5/8 seam allowance. I still had my machine set up from a previous stitch. All right, so 5/8 seam allowance. Go ahead and do your back stitch at the start. And we're going to stitch all the way along here. Remember to pull your pins out as you go. All right, back, cut my threads. Okay, so eventually this is going to turn to the wrong side of the garment. And to help it take that rollover, we're going to be doing an understitch. So what you do when you do an understitch is you first want to reduce the bulk and the layers of thickness you have here with your fabric. So take your scissors and go ahead and trim away your interfacing. Now mine just pulled away, even though it was fusible. I really didn't glue it down super hard, so it pulled away real easy from my fabric. Sometimes you have to kind of work it away, and then sometimes it's glued on so tight that you can't get it off of there. So if that's the case, just leave it. Hopefully it's not too thick. The interfacing I'm working with here is quite light and wouldn't have that much of an effect on it, but some of the heavier stuff can get a little too bulky. All right. We are then going to reduce our thicknesses by grading, and I know we've all done a grading sample, so I'm going to take one layer longer than the other. So I'm going to go ahead and take the one that's my facing piece, this one here, and reduce that down to about 1/4 of an inch from the stitch line. And you can use your big scissors too if you'd rather use those. I just happen to have my little ones here. And then my next layer, I'm going to make it just slightly longer than the one I previously cut. So I'm going to grade it to different lengths. And there you go. So that is grading. We have interfacing pretty much gone, and we have the 2 lengths of fabric at 2 different lengths. All right. Understitching. Understitching is when you connect the seam, so the seam allowance, to your facing piece. All right, so I'm going to stitch seam to facing, And the absolute big trick to this is pull your layers apart as you go. All right, so I'm going to put my hand here on the interfacing with the facing piece and one over here on the garment and kind of pull against there. So I'm really opening that seam up. I really don't want to go to the iron at this point. I want to just stay right here at my machine, because a lot of times when you're doing this, it's a curve, so it's not a flat little piece like this. And I'm going to start on my fabric a little bit. Again, pull this little layer apart, back stitch that we start. All right, and the foot will kind of hold this seam down, so you don't have to worry about the seam a whole lot, but you do have to keep tension on these two areas. So I kind of do both. You can get a good look at my hands here with the 3 fingers over here and my index fingers kind of working the seam down. I'm going to pull and then stitch, and I want to stitch right next to my original stitching, so right next to here, without crossing over it. So run your stitching along the seam without ever coming over to the garment. This is nothing that gets seen on the garment side of the fabric. So pull, hold the seam down, and stitch, and take your time. Not in a hurry. And again, a lot of times this is around curves and necklines and the tops of the waist, so you just give that attention there. Hold the seam down as you go, and work your way all the way to the end. And then I'm going to backstitch when I get to the end. And it's super cool what this does. It's a very purposeful stitch. It's not something that's just there for the heck of it. It serves a great purpose, and you will see it in a second here. So now, when I flip over that facing piece, so here's my garment, and this is the facing that will be on the inside of, say, the skirt, it rolls the garment side of your fabric just ever so slightly over to the wrong side, so you never have that facing peeping out the top of a waist or a neckline. If you get done and yours doesn't have that natural little roll over, and you actually see pieces of your facing popping out the top, my best guess is you did not pull apart as you were stitching. And if you don't pull and put a little strain on that seam, you get kind of the opposite effect. You actually have stitched an area where it bubbles up, and it'll definitely stick out the top of the front of the garment, and you do not want that. All right, so a good little pull as you're stitching. Run that stitch line right next to your original seam construction stitch. All right, and then when you're done, you should be able to just go over to the iron and give that a nice little flat press. Probably almost just finger press it, and you'll have something like that. And I really hope my camera can show that I have probably about a 1/16 of an inch of garment fabric that rolled to the wrong side. Just makes a beautiful top of the facing. All right, and that is the end of that sample. I'm going to give that a press, and we are done there. When you turn these in, please take a good picture of the top edge from the front side and the back side here. So do one from each side so I can really get a look at what you did there. All right, good job. One thing we want to do with the bottom of the facing is to zigzag the edge here. Typically I do that at the start. I just actually slipped my mind. That is usually one of the first steps they tell you to do, is zigzag or finish the lower edge. So I'm just going to run a zigzag along here, just like you do when you finish the edges of a inside of your seams. To prevent that raveling. Hopefully you saw there, you know, when you try to zigzag, do a back stitch with a zigzag on really thin single layer, like we've talked about before, it tends to want to eat your fabric, so don't force it if your machine doesn't like it. But you do want to finish that lower edge somehow. You don't want those threads raveling off, so you should have that little zigzag down there like so.